A calm voice, flashing lights in the rearview mirror. Your hands tighten on the steering wheel as your heart rate spikes. You pull over, just like you're supposed to, and yet, minutes later, you're in handcuffs. Not because you committed some major crime, but because of something you said, something you did, or something you didn't even realize mattered. In many cases, people don't get arrested during traffic stops because they're guilty of something serious. They get arrested because they make small, avoidable mistakes that escalate the situation without warning. And what happens next shocks most drivers, because by the time they realize what went wrong, it's already too late. Have you ever been pulled over before? What did you do in that moment? Stay calm, panic, argue, stay silent? Tell me in the comments, because what you're about to hear could be the difference between driving away and leaving in the back of a police car. And here's what most people don't realize. A traffic stop is not just a routine interaction. Under U.S. law, it is a legal detention. That means the officer has already exercised authority over you, and everything that happens from that moment forward, every word, every movement, every reaction, can either protect you or quietly build a case against you. And this is where things take a turn, because the first mistake most people make doesn't feel like a mistake at all. It feels like being cooperative. But cooperation, when misunderstood, can become self-incrimination. And that leads us to the first mistake that gets people arrested during traffic stops: talking too much. It sounds harmless. In fact, it feels polite. The officer approaches your window and asks a simple question: "Do you know why I pulled you over?" And most people answer immediately. They guess, they explain, they justify. "I might have been going a little fast. I didn't see the sign. I'm just trying to get home." But here's what most people don't realize. That question is not casual conversation. It is strategic. In many cases, officers are trained to ask open-ended questions early in the stop, because people tend to fill silence with information, and that information can be used later. Under U.S. law, anything you voluntarily say can be used as evidence. Courts have generally held that spontaneous admissions, statements you offer without coercion, are admissible. So when you say, "Yeah, I was probably speeding a bit," you've just confirmed the violation. No radar reading needed. No further proof required. And this is where things get dangerous, because once you start talking, you often don't stop. You try to be friendly. You try to explain. You try to clear things up. But every extra word increases your risk. What happens next shocks most drivers, because the conversation shifts. Where are you coming from? Where are you headed? Have you had anything to drink tonight? And now you're in a different kind of interaction entirely. Because these are not random questions. They are designed to establish patterns, inconsistencies, or suspicion. If your answers don't align perfectly, if you hesitate, if you contradict yourself even slightly, that can escalate the situation. And this is where things spiral. Because once suspicion increases, the stop can expand. More questions, more scrutiny, possibly even a search. And it all started with talking too much. But here's what most people don't realize. You are not required to answer every question during a traffic stop. Under U.S. law, you must provide identifying information, like your license, registration, and proof of insurance. But beyond that, you have the right to remain silent. That doesn't mean being rude. That doesn't mean being confrontational. It means being controlled, measured, careful. And that leads us to the second mistake: being argumentative or confrontational. This one feels justified. You believe you were wrongfully stopped. You feel the officer is being unfair, maybe even disrespectful, so you push back, you challenge, you raise your voice. "I didn't do anything wrong. This is ridiculous. You have no right to stop me." And emotionally, it feels empowering. But legally, it can escalate everything. Because here's what most people don't realize. Officers are trained to assess behavior, not just actions. Tone, body language, compliance. Under many state laws, behaviors perceived as interfering, obstructing, or resisting can lead to additional charges, even if the original stop was minor. Courts have generally held that escalating behavior during a lawful stop can justify further detention or enforcement action. So when a simple traffic violation turns into a heated argument, you're no longer just dealing with a ticket. You're creating a situation. And this is where things take a turn, because the officer now has to make a judgment call. Are you cooperative or are you a potential threat? And that perception changes everything. Backup may be called. Commands may become more direct, the tone shifts, and what happens next shocks most drivers. Because suddenly, you're being asked to step out of the vehicle. Your movements are being watched closely. Every gesture is scrutinized, and if you hesitate, if you resist, if you continue arguing, the situation can escalate further. Not because of the original violation, but because of your behavior during the stop. And here's the part most people regret. They think back later and say, if I had just stayed calm, if I hadn't argued, if I hadn't pushed back. Because the reality is, a traffic stop is not the place to win a debate. It's the place to stay legally protected. And this leads to the third mistake, making sudden or unexplained movements. This one happens fast, sometimes without thinking. You reach for your wallet, you grab your phone, you lean over to the glove compartment, and in your mind, you're just trying to cooperate. But from the officer's perspective, they don't know what you're reaching for, and that uncertainty is critical. In many cases, officers are trained to prioritize safety above all else. Traffic stops are considered high-risk encounters because the officer does not know who you are, what your intentions are, or what might be inside the vehicle. So when you move suddenly, without explanation, it raises immediate concern. And this is where things escalate quickly. Commands become sharper. Keep your hands where I can see them. Don't reach for anything. And if you continue moving, even unintentionally, the officer may interpret that as a potential threat. What happens next shocks most drivers, because the situation can shift from routine to high alert in seconds. Hands on weapons, backup called, orders repeated, and suddenly, you're no longer just a driver, you're a perceived risk. Courts have generally held that officers can take reasonable steps to ensure their safety during a stop. That includes controlling your movements, ordering you out of the vehicle, even conducting a limited search under certain conditions. And all of this can be triggered by a simple, misunderstood movement. But here's what most people don't realize. You can prevent this entirely by communicating clearly, by moving slowly, by explaining before you act. I'm going to reach for my wallet now. My registration is in the glove box. Simple words, but they change everything because they remove uncertainty. And uncertainty is what drives escalation. And this leads to the fourth mistake, consenting to a search without understanding your rights. This one is subtle because it doesn't feel like a mistake, it feels like cooperation. The officer asks, "Do you mind if I take a look inside your vehicle?" And most people say yes. Not because they want to, but because they feel like they have to. They think saying no will make things worse. They think it will raise suspicion. They think it's the right thing to do. But here's what most people don't realize. Under U.S. law, you have the right to refuse consent to a search. Courts have consistently held that consent must be voluntary. That means you can say no, politely, calmly, without consequence, at least not legally. But what happens next shocks most drivers, because when you say yes, you give up a powerful protection. You allow the officer to search areas they might not otherwise have legal access to. And if anything is found, even something you forgot about, even something that doesn't belong to you, it can be used against you. And this is where things get serious, because now the situation is no longer about a traffic violation. It's about evidence, and evidence changes everything. But here's the nuance most people miss. Refusing a search does not mean you are guilty. It means you are exercising a constitutional right. And in many cases, officers expect that. They understand that. So the key is not what you say, but how you say it. Calm, respectful, clear. I do not consent to any searches. No argument, no explanation, just a statement. And finally, the fifth mistake. Failing to understand when you are being detained versus when you are free to go. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of any traffic stop, because the line between a temporary detention and a prolonged interaction is not always obvious. At first, the stop is for a specific reason, a traffic violation, a broken light, speeding. But once that purpose is addressed, the the legal basis for the stop can change. In many cases, courts have held that a traffic stop should not be extended beyond the time reasonably necessary to handle the original reason for the stop, unless there is additional reasonable suspicion. But here's where people make the mistake. They don't clarify, they don't ask. They assume they have to stay. So the conversation continues. More questions, more probing, more time. And what happens next shocks most drivers. Because what started as a short stop turns into a prolonged interaction. And during that time, new issues can arise, new suspicions can form, new risks can appear. All because the driver didn't realize they might have been free to leave. But here's what most people don't realize. You can ask a simple question. Am I being detained or am I free to go? That question changes the dynamic because it forces clarity. If you are being detained, the officer must have a reason. If you are free to go, you can leave. And that awareness, that understanding, is what protects you. Because knowledge is not just power, it's control. Control over your actions, control over your words, control over your outcome. And this is where everything comes together. Because none of these mistakes happen in isolation, they build on each other. Talking too much leads to more questions. Arguing escalates tension. Sudden movements increase suspicion. Consent removes protection. Confusion prolongs the stop. And before you know it, a routine traffic stop becomes something much bigger, something you never expected, something you never intended. But here's the truth most people learn too late. It's not about outsmarting the system, it's about understanding it, staying calm, staying aware, staying in control. Because in many cases, the difference between going home and going into custody is not what you did before the stop, it's what you did during it. So the next time you see those flashing lights, remember this: slow down, pull over safely, keep your hands visible, speak carefully, move deliberately, and most importantly, understand your rights. Because what you do in those few minutes can shape everything that comes after. If this opened your eyes, subscribe, because the next thing you don't know might cost you even more. And share this with someone who drives, because one mistake is all it takes. And here's where most people think the story ends. They believe if they avoid those 5 mistakes, they're safe. But that's not entirely true, because what most drivers don't realize is that traffic stops don't just test your actions, they test your psychology, your patience, your awareness, your ability to stay composed under pressure. And this is where things take a deeper turn. Because even when you do everything right, there are still subtle behaviors, almost invisible ones, that can shift the outcome of a stop. And what happens next shocks most drivers, because these are the moments where people unknowingly give away control, without saying a single word. Let's go back to that moment. You're pulled over, engine off, hands on the wheel. You've decided to stay calm. You're not talking too much. You're not arguing. You're doing everything right. But then the officer approaches, and there's silence, a pause, a long, uncomfortable pause. And this is where most people break. Because silence feels unnatural, it feels tense, it feels like something is wrong. So what do people do? They fill the silence. They start talking again, explaining again, offering information that was never asked for. And this is where things quietly unravel. Because silence is not your enemy. In many cases, silence is your protection. Courts have generally held that you are not required to volunteer information during a lawful stop beyond basic identification. That means every extra word you offer is a choice, and that choice can either protect you or expose you. But here's what most people don't realize. Officers understand this psychological pressure. They know silence makes people uncomfortable, and in many cases, they wait. Not to intimidate, but to observe. To see if you'll speak. To see what you'll reveal. And what happens next surprises most drivers. Because the moment you start talking again, you often say more than you intended. You try to justify. You try to clarify. You try to make things easier. But instead, you create openings. Openings for more questions, more suspicion, more escalation. And this is where things take another turn, because now we enter something most people have never even heard of, the concept of reasonable suspicion. Under U.S. law, officers can extend a traffic stop if they develop reasonable suspicion that another crime may be occurring. But here's the critical detail. Reasonable suspicion does not require proof. It requires articulable facts. Behavior, inconsistencies, observations, and sometimes your own words. So when you speak unnecessarily, you may unknowingly contribute to that suspicion. And once that threshold is crossed, the entire nature of the stop can change. More questioning, requests to step out of the vehicle, possible searches under certain legal doctrines, and all of it feels sudden, unexpected, confusing. Because in your mind, you were just being cooperative. But here's what most people never see coming. Even your tone can matter, the way you respond, the speed of your answers, your body language. All of it is being processed, not just consciously, but instinctively, because officers are trained to assess behavior patterns. And while none of these things alone prove anything, together they can influence decisions. And that leads to another subtle but critical mistake, trying too hard to appear innocent. This one surprises people because it sounds counterintuitive. Why would appearing innocent be a problem? But think about it. When people feel nervous, they often overcompensate. They become overly polite, overly talkative, overly eager to explain. I promise I wasn't speeding. I never do this. I'm a good driver. And while these statements seem harmless, they can come across as rehearsed or defensive. And this is where things shift, because instead of appearing calm, you appear anxious. Instead of appearing controlled, you appear reactive. And what happens next catches most drivers off guard. Because now the officer is paying closer attention, not because of what you did, but because of how you're acting. And this is the part most people misunderstand. The goal during a traffic stop is not to convince the officer of your innocence. It's to avoid creating additional issues. Because innocence is not proven on the roadside. It's addressed through the legal process if necessary. But escalation can happen instantly. And that's what you're trying to avoid. And here's where another layer comes in. Your phone. Most people don't think twice about it. They reach for it. They start recording. Or worse, they start texting, scrolling, looking down. And from their perspective, it's normal. But from the officer's perspective, it's uncertainty. What are you doing? Who are you contacting? Are you distracted? Are you ignoring instructions? And this is where things can escalate again. Not because recording is illegal. In many cases, courts have recognized the right to record police in public spaces. But the manner matters. If your actions interfere with the stop, if they create confusion or distraction, that can become an issue. So the key is awareness. If you choose to record, do it calmly. Do it visibly. Do not let it interfere with communication. Because the goal is not confrontation. It's documentation. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. But here's another twist. Passengers. Most drivers focus entirely on themselves, their behavior, their words, their rights. But what about the people in the car? Because their actions can impact the situation just as much. If a passenger is talking loudly, arguing, making sudden movements, refusing to comply, that can escalate the entire stop. And here's what most people don't realize. The driver is often held responsible for the overall situation. So even if you are calm, even if you are respectful, someone else's behavior can change everything. And what happens next shocks most drivers. Because now the officer's attention is divided. Risk increases. Control becomes a priority. And the situation can escalate quickly. So awareness isn't just about you. It's about everyone in the vehicle. And this leads to something even deeper. Expectation versus reality. Most people expect a traffic stop to follow a script. Officer approaches. Officer asks questions. Officer issues a warning or ticket. You leave. But real-life interactions don't always follow that script. They evolve. They shift. They respond to variables. And when those variables change, so does the outcome. And this is where preparation becomes power. Not fear, not paranoia, but awareness. Because when you understand how these interactions work, you remove uncertainty. And when you remove uncertainty, you reduce risk. But here's the final piece most people overlook. Time. Not clock time, but emotional time. Those few minutes during a stop can feel longer than they actually are. Your heart is racing, your thoughts are scattered. You feel pressure to respond quickly, to say the right thing, to do the right thing. But speed is not your ally. Control is. Taking a breath, pausing before you speak, moving deliberately. These small actions create stability, and stability prevents escalation. Because in many cases, it's not the situation that causes problems, it's how quickly it spirals. And once it spirals, it becomes harder to control. So slow it down, ground yourself, stay present. And remember, you don't need to win the interaction. You just need to get through it safely and legally. Because at the end of the day, that's what matters. Getting home, not with a story of what went wrong, but with the quiet confidence that you handled it right. And here's the truth that stays with people long after the stop is over. The law is not just about rules, it's about decisions, your decisions, in moments that feel small but carry real consequences. So the next time you're behind the wheel and those lights appear behind you, don't just react, think, because what you do next might be the most important few minutes of your entire day. If this made you think differently, subscribe, because understanding your rights isn't optional, it's essential. And share this with someone who drives every day, because most people won't learn this until it's already too late.